I think for a lot of people that find themselves in high conflict relationship, antagonistic relationship, toxic relationships, have a chance when they get to this devalue stage, if they're able to identify that, look, I'm feeling isolated, I'm getting more confused, this person keeps lying, manipulating me, gaslighting me, and gaslighting is denying someone's reality and wanting them to accept your own reality, whereas that is not the case. They lie so much that you start to think, maybe this is not right for me. Anyone that's able to leave this relationship at this devalue stage, there is so much more chance for you to rebuild yourself and rebuild your relationship, and at that stage you actually wouldn't have lost a lot from that relationship. Hi, and welcome back to the channel with your host Susan. The sun's out and all is well. Now we're going to start a new series, and this was actually based off of one of you guys requesting on me helping to talk about what this is. If you've ever been in a situation where you are finding that you're stuck in a trap or a cycle of a toxic relationship, but you can't really understand why you can't get out of it, then this one is for you. I would like to start on the series of trauma bonds. And in this series, I want to talk about what trauma bonds really are, how they differ from the Stockholme syndrome. I want to talk about the origins of trauma bonds, and I also want to talk about the 5 cycles of how they form and how they cement a lot of people, most times keeping them stuck in toxic relationships even though they have a choice to leave. Trauma bonds are very painful, but yet they're very ingrained relationship cycles that cement an abuser and a victim. And although the abuser knows that they have a choice to leave the relationship, most times they can't leave that relationship because they are used to a pattern of behavior in that relationship. These bonds make it very difficult for the abused victim to leave that relationship because of the patterns of the cement that has taken place. Understanding trauma bonds is so essential to live the life God has called us to live. We see that in John 8:33. Jesus told his followers that you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. He further on went on in verse 38 to say, whom the Son has set free is truly free indeed. Now the question begs, how do we even know to walk in freedom if we don't even know what the truth is? Now this is going to be a very heavy episode, so I want you to make sure you're really comfortable. If you're driving home from the office or from an event and you've got a few minutes to spare, you would need to be attentive in this session. I want you to also get your notepad and your pen ready if you're more settled in your own comfort, and make some notes on some of the things that I'll be sharing in this video. And I really do pray that it would change your perspective on some of the things that you have noticed in your own relationship, or maybe bring this knowledge to someone, a loved one, a friend, a colleague, a family member that you know is going through this very toxic cycle of a high conflict type of a relationship. Now, a trauma bond is a strong emotional attachment that often develops between the victim and their abuser, and it forms a cycle of abuse and intermittent reinforcement, which is a summary way of saying cycles between abuse and kindness to further cement that toxic relationship. What is the difference between a trauma bond and Stockholm syndrome? Well, in my research, I got to understand that both trauma bonds and Stockholm syndrome, they form this type of an attachment style based off of a victim and abuser attachment style. What do I mean by this? In a Stockholm syndrome situation, it's normally found that this happens between a hostage and a captive situation where there are no emotional attachments, but however, there's very strong power imbalance between both the captor and the person that's captured, the victim. On the other hand, when a trauma bond happens, it also happens between like a victim and an abusive like attachment relationship, where however, there's an emotional attachment in the trauma bonded relationship. And it's most times also there is a presence of the power imbalance, but it's not as strong as when you have it in the Stockholm sort of capture abuser relationship. Now, in a trauma bonded relationship, it's oftentimes always longer term, whereas a Stockholm syndrome relationship is oftentimes shorter term. And it's always longer term in a trauma bonded relationship because of the presence of the emotional attachment, and also it takes place a lot in a romantic sort of relationship setting. Now, notice that there's an emotional attachment that forms in a trauma bonded relationship because most times it takes place in a romantic relationship setting, but the emotional attachment can also take place in a Stockholm syndrome captive situation over a long period of time. Now, the only difference between a Stockholm relationship attachment and also a trauma bonded relationship attachment is the presence of the intermittent reinforcement. If you notice, in most captive-captor situations, the captive can't leave the captor because of that strong power imbalance. So most times they are stuck in that situation until there's a rescue mission that happens and occurs. But in a trauma bonded relationship, there's no rescue mission that one is hoping and expecting to happen because it's already taking place in a romantic relationship where the person that's been, in essence, taken captive in that relationship has the hope that things will get better. Now, this is where the danger of intermittent reinforcement comes into play. And I'm going to talk on intermittent reinforcement a bit further along in this video. A lot of the times, intermittent reinforcement has this strength of kind of giving the victim a hope that things will get better. So in essence, the hope in that relationship is the hook that keeps the victim like staying in that relationship, even though they know that what they're going through is abusive. So trauma bonded relationships often last longer, though the abused victim has a choice to leave. But because of the presence of intermittent reinforcement, a lot of the times the victim would not make that conscious decision or choice to leave that destructive relationship. Now, this is the hook. I like to see it as the intermittent reinforcement is the hook of hope that things are going to get better in a trauma bonded relationship. And so the victim, though they know that that this is not healthy and this is not right, they often stay because they hope that things get better. Tim Fletcher once did a research on how trauma bonds originate. And a lot of the times when there's a dysfunction in our adult life, it is so important to go back to our childhood and assess what happened, what went wrong. According to psychologists, trauma bonds actually originate and they form in childhood, where a child does not form a secure attachment with their primary caregiver. It could also be further cemented along the way as this child grows up through adolescence, through puberty, then becoming an adult, when their primary emotional needs are not met. So when these happens, it can cause the child that now becomes an adult to become more self-reliant, so counter-dependent. That means having less dependence on other people, becoming more self-reliant, having a sense of shame and guilt, being absolutely self-critical and feeling like they can't do anything right, but having more compassion for other people. They also have unrealistic self-appraisal, where they feel like they always want to do something, and if they don't achieve that item, they kind of don't praise themselves, or they don't even praise themselves for the little things that they achieve. And they always are so self-critical that it's so difficult for them to know how to celebrate their little wins. And if things don't go right, they often also have self-directed anger and blame. So people that often grow up with this less secure attachment to their primary caregiver often have this self-directed anger and blame at themselves if things don't turn out the way they thought it would have turned out or hoped they would have turned out. And they have very little window to love themselves, forgive themselves, and just to accept that they're also human and they are prone to making mistakes and errors. Aside from originating in childhood, trauma bonds can also form when someone has gone through or been through a past experience or relationship where there was abuse present, and this individual actually has not come to the realization that there needs to be healing work that goes into unraveling the things that made them get into that abusive relationship in the first place. I like to say it as many people who actually struggle with trauma bonds or find themselves in trauma bonded toxic relationships were raised in an environment where they were manipulated, controlled, gaslit, and they were never loved unconditionally, but rather they were loved conditionally. That's based off of the things that they could give to their primary caregiver, or maybe coming out of a relationship that was toxic, they were loved only based on the things that they could have done for their ex-partner. So they could have experienced neglect. So growing up in a home where emotional needs were not met can lead to seeking validation from unhealthy sources. They could have also experienced inconsistent affection. Experiencing love and kindness inconsistently, this will create a deep longing for approval, making it difficult to recognize manipulation. And finally, people like these also are prone to manipulation and control. So those who have been controlled or are controlled have been gaslit in their youth, so will often repeat these same patterns when they become an adult in relationships themselves. So when someone grows up thinking that love and pain are intertwined, they will actually form this mindset that this is how relationship dynamics form. And they are more likely to accept relationships that mirror this love, pain, intertwined dynamic. In Jeremiah 31 verse 3, God says, I have loved you with an everlasting love. What the enemy tries to do with relationships like this is to cause us to believe in the deception that we are not worthy of love. But I want to remind you of what God tells you in Jeremiah 31 verse 3. Now, if you've not done this so far and you've been watching and listening to all the stuff that has been produced from this channel, why don't you do me a favor and subscribe to this channel, like this video, comment on everything that you're hearing so far, and let me know how it's been helping you in your own life. Remember, when you do this, you support this channel. You also support everyone else that is in that same position as you, that needs to hear a similar message that would help them identify the toxicity in their own relationships. Let's jump right into it. Now, in the next few minutes, I want to discuss on how trauma bonds form. There are 5 key stages, and I like to see them as cyclical, depending on the relationship between the abuser and the victim, or the next target of the victim. And I'm going to explain this shortly. So trauma bonds often form, I've got my pen and my board here. It often forms with the first stage of love bombing. So in this love bombing stage, the abuser starts by showering the abused victim with gifts, excessive self-compassion, unrealistic love. This abuser is so good at making you feel like you're the most important thing that's ever happened on the earth. They make you feel that you're so loved, you're so cherished. They make so many promises of love. They give you, out of these worlds, sometimes gifts that are so expensive that you're thinking, how am I getting such an expensive type of gift? This is the first stage of how the trauma bond forms. Once they got you hooked on this very first stage, the next stage to go into is the devalue stage. Now, in the devalue stage, what the abuser does is that they begin to introduce manipulation tactics. They begin to introduce control tactic. They start to isolate you from your friends, family, loved one. If you're in a relationship with someone that you have met in a city, they start to think of ways to move you away from your comfort zone, your comfort area. They make sure that the people that are around you that can help you see past all the excessive love, kindness, and attention that was being shown on you are not actually going to be voices anymore, the voices of reason that can help you reassess this relationship. They make things move so fast and so quickly, you don't have time, like me just right now, to catch your breath. You don't have time to actually assess the things that are going on. So in this stage, they actually introduce confusion. So at that point, they introduce confusion to the victim and self-doubt. Now, the third stage, and I mentioned this one earlier, is the intermittent reinforcement. This is so critical and key. I think for a lot of people that find themselves in high conflict relationship, antagonistic relationship, toxic relationships, have a chance when they get to this devalue stage, if they're able to identify that, look, I'm feeling isolated, I'm getting more confused, this person keeps lying, manipulating me, gaslighting me, and gaslighting is denying someone's reality and wanting them to accept your own reality, whereas that is not the case. They lie so much that you start to think, maybe this is not right for me. Anyone that's able to leave this relationship at this devalue stage, there is so much more chance for you to rebuild yourself and rebuild your relationship. And at that stage, you actually wouldn't have lost a lot from that relationship. Now, when we get to the intermittent reinforcement stage, I was doing a bit of reading the other day, and there was a researcher, Harry Hallow, that did an experiment with some monkeys. Now, if anyone has come across this before, you're welcome to review this with me. I'm not going to go into much details. There's so many research and writings, and there's a video that was done by a professor at the university on YouTube. If you just Google intermittent reinforcement experiment on monkeys, it's going to give you more detailed breakdown of how this pattern forms. But in essence, intermittent reinforcement plays on the psychology of the victim to stay in a relationship, and this is how they do it. So when you find out that you're in an intermittent reinforcement relationship, if anyone has studied biology, you know that there's a part of the brain that releases dopamine. So dopamine is a hormone that's released in a part of the brain, and this is your feel-good hormone. If you go to the gym, if you do things that you enjoy, there's a sense of feeling of accomplishment, or there's a sense that you're feeling like, oh, I'm getting something out of what I'm doing. This is the same hormone that's released when this experiment happened. So what was the experiment? There were some monkeys that were put in cages, and the more that the monkeys were hitting particular target, they were fed the reward, and the reward was they food bananas. Now, whenever these monkeys realized that the bananas were coming, they would start to work hard to get that reward. So at this stage, this is the stage that they started to feel like this reward is going to come. But dopamine was actually not released at this stage. It was at this stage when they had done the work. That's when the dopamine was released. And from my understanding, this is where they started to work to get the reward of the banana. Now, in intermittent relationships, the hook is there's going to be a crossover between abuse, right? And then kindness. Right. When there's that crossover between abuse and kindness, that introduces confusion even more into the mind of the victim. So the victim plays on the sandbox of the abuser, where they start to feel that if I can just work harder, if I can just do this more, if I can just work harder, this person is going to be better. There's hope that things can change, because every time I work harder, they are nice to me. Every time I don't cross into their boundary, dopamine is released because they give me gifts. They are nice to me. But the moment I feel like I'm not going to do that anymore, this doesn't come. So because I want to receive this from the abuser, I'm going to keep working harder. But the unfortunate thing is, the abuser consistently makes the abused victim think that they're going to keep being nice to them because they want them to be nice to them, but they actually keep them stuck in this cycle where they constantly work hard for things that were unrealistic. So what I've written down is, so intermittent reinforcement ideally is a cycle that alternates between kindness and cruelty, and it keeps the victim emotionally off balance and hopefully making them think that things will improve. And the hope in that sort of cycle is the hook that things will get better. So they keep getting hooked back into the relationship, even though they're sensing that things aren't right, but they keep getting hooked back in because there's that constant dopamine there's that constant dopamine that's been delivered by the abuser. So this doesn't give the victim a chance to even think about the actual scenario of the situation. Remember that at this stage also, the victim has been isolated from any support networks or any sounding board that will cause them to have a second thought about the state of the relationship or give a second chance to reflect on the relationship. Also remember that in the devalue stage, at the stage before, the abuser has also started doing things around manipulating them and trying to control them so that the victim starts to doubt their own reality. So when confusion was introduced at the devalue stage, in the intermittent stage, this is when confusion has now been cemented. So what do I mean by this? The victim, unfortunately, now starts to doubt their own reality. They're starting to accept the lies and the gaslighting and the manipulation and control tactic of the abuser as truth. And now because they don't have anyone else in their friendship bubble or in their loved one bubbles that's giving them a sounding board, perhaps because they've moved away or they have chosen to cut these people out of their lives because they want to work on their relationship, they're now literally cemented into the delusional world of these toxic, abusive individuals. So once intermittent reinforcement has been established, the next stage would be to go for the abuser to cause the victim to feel dependency and submission. When the victim now is dependent on the abuser, they literally feel like they can't do anything without the abuser. They feel like they can't live without the abuser. They feel like they can't function without the abuser. So the victim becomes emotionally reliant on the abuser, believing that they can't do anything without them. Once that submission phase has been achieved, then there's a sense of fear and guilt. So in this step 5, when fear and guilt now is introduced into that cycle, that pattern of toxicity, the victim feels like if they try to leave, there's going to be retaliation from the abuser. They're going to get punished if they try to leave. So out of fear and guilt, they now feel like they don't have a choice but to stay in that relationship. Now, when this has been achieved, here comes the abuser again. So rather than going back into love bombing their abuse victim, because they've now cemented this individual as in essence, as an involuntary captive in this relationship, what the abuser normally would do is go back down. So this abuser would then go back down into intermittent reinforcement. So this is victim 1. That person will then continue the cycle of going back into intermittent reinforcement when they start to be nice and kind and cruel at the same time. The abuser is being kind and is being cruel at the same time, further cementing the confusion of the victim. The victim then not having a choice of the reality of the relationship. They're isolated, they're further being isolated, they're further not feeling like something is right, but they can't put their finger on why this is happening. And then it goes back into dependency and submission. The abuse victim is consistently then feeling like without the abuser, they don't know how to do anything, they can't function. The emotional dependence is on the abuser, and then there's fear and guilt. They can't leave because if they leave, there's going to be retaliation from the abuser. Then they go back and say, it's just a freaking sick cycle. Victim 1 could also, it's either that the abuser chooses to have that intermittent reinforcement relationship with them again, or if this individual that's the abuser is done with the relationship, what they can also do is they would discard that individual. So from that fear and guilt cycle, they actually can go back into discard, like just saying, I'm not interested in this relationship anymore. I've gotten all the things that I want to do. My narcissistic supply has dried out, so I'm going to just get rid of you. I'm sorry, I don't want you anymore. Because most times when they discard their victim, it's because they've already started a relationship with another individual. Now, this individual I want to call victim 2 because they really don't see what's coming to them. So victim 2 will now be the new target of this individual. But I'm not going to touch much on narcissistic relationships and narcissistic individuals in this video because that's not my focus. My focus is trying to understand trauma bonding, and it really is a cycle that's reinforced by hope. And hope in these kinds of relationship, this toxic kinds of relationship, this high conflict, antagonistic kinds of relationships, is the hook for a lot of the victims that stay in dysfunctional. Though they have a choice to leave, but because they're either afraid that if they leave, there's going to be retaliation from the abuser, that the abuser is going to use something that they have worked on together to get at them, or there's going to be like constant devaluing. So my advice is, if anyone finds themselves in any of these stages, I'll say reevaluate your life, reevaluate where you are, and just be like as brutally honest with yourself as possible. If I continue like this for another 5 years, for another 10 years, for another 15 years, like how realistic can I keep up with this level of cruelty? No one deserves to treat you with any level of cruelty. I'm going to open a scripture. 2 Timothy 1:7 reminds us, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power, of love, and of a sound mind." If anyone is finding themselves in a relationship that's making them afraid that if I leave, if I try to make a change with it, which is going to be a healthy change overall in my life, in my relationship, and I'm feeling afraid, that certainly cannot be of God. That certainly cannot be from God. If you're in a relationship where it's always like you're in this situation where one moment everything is up, right? And the next minute it goes back down, and then it's up again, and then it's down. And it's like a cycle of inconsistency, and things just keep moving. One minute everything is good, right? And the next minute everything goes back down. And then another minute it goes back up again. And then the next minute it goes back down. And we're thinking, this is not stable. And the longer you stay in these kinds of relationships, the more difficult it is to leave. The more difficult it is to even leave. So God has not given us a spirit of fear, but He's given us a spirit of love, power, and of sound mind. So any relationship that causes us to fall into the cyclical cycle of staying in a trauma bond is not healthy. I want to just remind you that trauma bonds, they strengthen those toxic cycles, this dysfunctional cycle of love bombing, devaluation, intermittent reinforcement, dependency and submission, fear and guilt. It makes the victim feel powerless to escape. And the good news is that trauma bonds, they're powerful, they're not unbreakable. Recognizing their presence in your life and their dynamics in your life is the first step to healing. So by understanding why trauma bonds form and how they form and how they're present in our lives, this is the first step to untangling the history of trauma bonds in our life and actually doing the deep work of healing our minds, our bodies, and our souls. And this will also cause us to untangle ourselves from toxic relationship dynamics, and focus on the love of God for us, and also focus on the words of God concerning us and the promises that He has given us. If you've ever struggled with trauma bond, I want you to remember that the love of God is greater than any chain that the enemy has put on your life to bind you and to speak deception into your life. And God's desire is that we live whole and happy and in peace. I want to invite you to share your experiences with me in the comment section. How has the Lord touched your heart? How has God healed you from a past toxic relationship? How has God broken the siege of trauma bonds over your life? I want to know, and I want to interact with you in the comment section. And if there's any other topic that you want me to discuss, I'm more than happy to consider these topics in the next few videos. Next time, I want to go into more detail in identifying trauma bonds, their signs, and the symptoms. If you've been tracking with me so far, why don't you like this video, share, subscribe? As you do so, you are blessing this channel. You're also encouraging others that need help, just like you do, to also come into contact with this video, to like this video, and also engage with all the materials that have been provided on this video. If you're also looking for a community of believers that have been called to walk out of the life of pain and fear and guilt, and to walk into the life that God has for us, why don't you join our community? I'm going to put the QR code right here for you so that you don't miss a beat in any of the materials that will be provided going forward. Thank you for your time in this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.